As the fallout continues from these attacks, some experts are raising concerns that it may have violated international law. For some analysis on this, let's bring in Brian Finucane in Washington. He is a senior advisor for the U.S. program at the International Crisis Group and a former State Department legal advisor under Presidents Barack Obama and Donald Trump. Brian, thank you so much for making time for us today.
My pleasure.
So Hezbollah's leader today accused Israel of breaking all conventions and laws. Was weaponizing these devices, these pagers, these walkie-talkies in this way, was it illegal?
So let's step back and provide some context. Since October 8th, Hezbollah and Israel have been engaged in an armed conflict, at least since October 8th. And as such, the law of armed conflict, the law of war, international humanitarian law, governs the conduct of those hostilities. That law contains rules pertaining to targeting, such as the prohibition on targeting civilians, prohibitions on indiscriminate attacks, requirements that parties assess proportionality prior to attacks, requirements of taking feasible measures to spare civilians in attacks. But there are also specific rules relating to weapons that are prohibited. And Israel, along with Lebanon and the United States and many other countries, are parties to an international agreement referred to as Amended Protocol 2 of the Convention on Certain Conventional Weapons. And this agreement contains a specific prohibition on booby-traps or other devices in the form of an apparently harmless portable object, which are specifically designed or constructed to contain explosive material. And so this specific prohibition very much seems to be implicated by the information that's coming out about the pager attack. And all the available information suggests that it was indeed Israel behind this attack, and that these pagers were manufactured to contain explosives.
Why would a booby trap be included in those agreements? You know, what is it? What does it intend to do? Who is it intended to protect by having that sort of rule in there that you can't use booby traps?
So these rules are in large part a function of historical experience, and they were meant to address various practices, largely by the enemies of the U.S. and other aligned powers during World War II and during the Cold War, in which booby traps were mass manufactured and mass distributed and posed a significant risk to civilians. So this was the case with respect to the Axis powers during the Second World War. And it was also the case with respect to the Soviet Union, its invasion, occupation of Afghanistan, and it was specifically cited by the U.S. Senate when it provided its approval for the U.S. to enter into this agreement, the Soviet practice of the mass manufacture and distribution of these booby traps. And so there was humanitarian concerns involved here, which is that the mass manufacture and distribution of booby traps is more likely to endanger civilians and more likely to endanger non-combatants.
And you can see the humanitarian concerns in this situation as well, Brian. But I do wonder, you mentioned that there's rules around targeting as well. So if you were to look at these devices as having targeted the Hezbollah militants, would that be considered an argument that would, supersede or get around the idea that these would be considered booby traps if they were, a targeted thing such as a drone attack?
No, these rules are additive. They are additional layers. And so you have very fact-specific analysis regarding the targeting rules, and it's really difficult to provide any sort of answers on that front based on what we know at this point. But the prohibition on these sorts of booby traps is a general and more or less per se prohibition, and it's much less fact specific. And so based on the information we have coming out thus far, we're in a much better place to render a more confident judgment that these actions, may well have violated this prohibition.
Okay, and while that investigation is done, while that understanding is, clarified over time here, Brian, what would this mean for countries such as the United States that support Israel if, in fact, Israel was the attacker here, and if it is decided that what it did was illegal?
Well, as you noted prior to this segment, I think the priority really needs to be focusing on the risk of escalation, the risk of a wider war, and preventing that, forestalling that. And that will likely require the U.S. to finally, and after much too much time, use its leverage in the form of its military support to Israel to try to bring about a ceasefire in Gaza, which would hopefully calm tensions in the wider region, including in the north between Hezbollah and Israel. That has to be the priority. Now, it's also very important that the U.S. get answers about this particular incident, because it provides military support to Israel, and it should not be enabling law of war violations, and it should be assuring itself that its partners are complying with the law of war. But the priority now must be saving lives going forward, in addition to try to figure out the facts of this particular incident.
Okay, Brian, really appreciate your perspective on this and your insights. Thank you for your time.
My pleasure. Thank you.
That was former attorney advisor to the U.S. State Department, Brian Finucane, and he joined us from Washington.